G'day everyone, my name's Greg Canavan. I'm the Editorial Director here at Port Phillip Publishing. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce you to and be joined by Jim Rickards and his co-editor Nick Hubble from Strategic Intelligence. G'day guys, how are we?
Fine, Greg. Great to be with you.
Not bad, not bad.
We are discussing the US presidential election and we're pretty much 1 week away from it. James, Jim, sorry, I just read your lengthy report that's just gone out to subscribers of Strategic Intelligence, and you've described this election as the most important US election in history. Can you give us a bit more detail around that? Because we often hear that every 4 years, don't we? Why is this one different?
I think that's right. First of all, we do hear it every 4 years, and probably each campaign has some reason to put that out there because they're trying to simulate turnout and voter interest and all that. So it makes sort of sense from a PR point of view. But I was looking at it, and in my article for Strategic Intelligence, looked at it from a more historical perspective. We've been having elections, presidential elections, every 4 years since 1789. So we have a little bit of a track record. And I was able to go back and some of them were very inconsequential. Some of them were very uncontroversial, but there were certain elections that stood out. And if you ask me, the single most consequential, important election in the United States history, at least so far, I would say 1860. That was when Abraham Lincoln was on the ballot. He was the first Republican president against his Democratic opponent. But we were on the brink of civil war. The southern states had said publicly, John Calhoun and other leaders of the South said, if Lincoln wins, we will secede from the Union. Just that simple. Well, Lincoln won, and they succeeded, or they purported to succeed. And of course, there were Union forts, northern forts in Southern Territory, which were attacked. And so that was the beginning of the Civil War, and that went on for 4 years. Historians keep updating the number of fatalities. Basically, the number doesn't change, but the records and the research do. And they now estimate that 750,000 Americans were killed during the Civil War. And that's more than World War I and World War II and Vietnam combined. The U.S., other belligerents had more casualties, but the U.S. did not lose as many soldiers or men and women in those wars combined as the Civil War. So, and then out of that came a Northern victory, putting the Union back together, Reconstruction, the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, et cetera, et cetera. So that's probably number one, but this could be number two, and maybe in the fullness of time, depending on who wins, even more important. And I say that because often the two campaigns, Republican and the Democrat parties, which we've had for well over 100 years at this point, they have some differences. Maybe one wants higher taxes than the other, one wants more regulation than the other, but there's a consensus on a lot of issues, some differences, and that's what you talk about in the campaign, the policy driven, a little bit the personality of the candidates, and you go from there. Here, the parties could not be further apart. The country is polarized. I think that's pretty well known. The candidates, the two parties are polarized. And the platforms point in every respect, point in 180-degree opposite directions. So just to go through some of it quickly, Trump will either lower taxes or keep them the same. Biden will raise taxes. He will double the capital gains tax from 20% to 39.6%, almost 40%. So practically double the capital gains tax. That could cause a run in the stock market in November, December if he wins, because he's not sworn in until January. He doesn't actually become president until January if he wins. And by the time they pass the tax law, the most they could do is make it retroactive to January 1st, 2021. Well, if Biden wins on November 3rd and you know the capital gains rate is going to double on January 1st, what are you going to do in November, December? You're going to sell your stocks and pay the lower capital gains rate. So, but not just that, the Green New Deal, so-called, is a multi-trillion-dollar program. Some estimates are as high as, $40 trillion over 10 years. Well, that's $4 trillion a year, which is more than the entire budget of the United States of America. Free tuition, free healthcare, free childcare, and then more regulation, end of oil and natural gas, end of the fossil fuel industry. So I could go down a long list, no need to recite them all. But the point is, you're talking, when you talk healthcare, you're talking 15% of the US economy. When you talk energy, you're talking over 10% of the US economy and tens of millions of jobs. When you talk student loans, you're talking $1.6 trillion of additional debt if you forgive the student loans. And as I say, Green New Deal could be as high as $40 trillion. So these are astronomical numbers, huge chunks of the economy that will go in literally opposite directions. One, in the case of Biden, towards socialism or worse. And in the case of Trump, probably our last best hope to roll back some regulation and get America back to something a little more of a positive course. The candidates couldn't be more different. Trump is, love him or hate him. He's highly energetic. He's kind of younger than his age. Now we're in the last week or so. He's doing 6 rallies a day. He gets up at dawn. He gets up before dawn. Rallying, just hops around. He's doing airport style rallies, so he can go from one to the other. Some of them are unannounced on very short notice, getting huge crowds, 25, 30,000 people. Biden is comfortably locked in his basement. And people say, well, why doesn't he get out there on the campaign trail? Well, of course, that makes sense. But what people don't realize is that he is suffering at least early stage dementia. His mind is clouded. It's actually a shame. I mean, his wife and family should intervene and get him out of the race, but they won't. And but the reason his own staff won't let him out is because he can't go out, because he invariably blunders. He can't think and can't form coherent sentences. Last night, he did a video kind of thing, we're doing here. And he said something about my opponent, George, and his wife goes, Trump, whispered in his ear. And then he paused and then said Trump. So he doesn't even know who he's running against, let alone where he is. So again, one guy's high energy out on the campaign trail, 6 rallies a day, flying all over the country. The other guy's locked in his basement, frail, a little bit of a husk in terms of vitality and mental acuity, and completely different policies. So if Biden wins, you're going to see America. It would be as if Jeremy Corbyn had somehow won in the UK. If Trump wins, you're going to see, certainly stronger growth and more, less regulation, lower taxes, et cetera. So it couldn't be more different. These are not just shades of gray, so to speak. These are not just nuances in policy. These are 2 different visions for America.
It's a real fork in the road moment, isn't it? Jim, you're joining us from New Hampshire in the US at the moment. Nick, you're in London. What's the view over there? I mean, obviously, as a Western democracy and a major ally of the US, there must be quite a lot of interest in this upcoming election in London or in the UK.
There definitely is a lot of interest, but it seems to me that the ideological division that's dominating the US holds even more true here than British interests. So people would prefer a Biden victory if they like Biden style politics, even if that was bad for Britain going into Brexit. And the Brexiteers want Trump, even if they were to say disagree with him. So that same populism, Brexit themed ideological belief set, the establishment versus the populist politician, that's dominant here too as a theme, and especially in the media, they're pitching just like the US is.
And that's probably a function of you being in London and these, I guess, capital cities similar to, say, Los Angeles or New York, very, liberal cities with that type of viewpoint. Which brings me to the next question, Jim. 4 years ago, you attended one of our conferences just prior to the 2016 election. I remember you were giving a speech before the crowd at this conference, and we're in a pretty similar situation to what we are now. The polls were heavily against Trump. Everyone expected Hillary Clinton victory, and you got up and predicted a Trump victory for a number of reasons. So perhaps if you wouldn't mind giving listeners a bit of an idea of why you think the polls are wrong and why you're predicting a Trump victory again next week.
Sure, and I remember that event very well. It's always been to Australia many times. My first visit there was 1981, and been back many times since. It's one of my favorite places. But I remember the conference. I knew it was a friendly audience because when I said Trump would win, no one threw anything. So that I took that as a good sign. But on that same trip, although the reason I was in Australia, partly for the conference, but my new or book at the time, 2016, The Road to Ruin had just come out. So I was on a world book tour. But I did a TV interview on ABC with my friend Tiki Fullerton. She's one of your most popular news, business news readers and news anchors. So we're on live TV, and I wanted to talk about the book, but she wanted to talk about the election. This was the last week of October. We were just a couple of days away. And she said, "So Jim, you're the American hero. Who's going to win the election?" I said, "Donald Trump." And Tiki's great. Her face just turned white, her jaw dropped, and she was like, "What? How is that possible?" And I explained. And the great thing about video is you save the tape, and so if you turn out to be right, you can always bring back the tape. But there were a number of reasons I said that at the time, and a lot of those reasons prevail today. I have models. I don't just do it on a whim. By the way, the hardest thing, what I do as an analyst, the hardest thing there is to do is to separate your personal opinion from your forecast or your analysis. I have a personal opinion. I'll go out and vote, and everyone will do the same. But you can't let your preference cloud the analysis, or else the analysis is not that good, and you're just another voice in the crowd. But I have rigorous models. They have a number of factors. Some of them are applied mathematics. Some of them are well-established equations. Some of it's anecdotal. A lot of statisticians don't like anecdotal evidence because it's hard to quantify. My view is elections are real people, and anecdotal evidence is real people. So why wouldn't you use that if you can? And I do. But one of the big questions I had going into the 2020 cycle was, well, okay, the Democrats ran a certain playbook in 2016. They lost. So if you run the same playbook, you'll probably lose again. So I kept asking myself, well, what have they learned? You can learn, you can adapt, you can change things. What are the Democrats doing in 2020 that's different from what they did in 2016? And if you found that, you have to pay attention to it, because that could be the margin of victory. And I couldn't find anything. I mean, they're still name calling. They still think it's enough to just call Trump, an idiot or a buffoon, or the orange man is bad, or whatever it is. He can't do anything right. He gets no credit for anything, and keep their candidate kind of under wraps. Hillary was notorious for not going to Wisconsin and Michigan in the final 2 days of the campaign. Everyone wants to get up there. She just took it for granted. She was the anointed one, et cetera. So whether it's a candidate not in the best of health, and Hillary wasn't in the best of health in 2016, whether it's relying on name calling, relying on negativity, keeping your candidate under wraps, over relying on the polls, et cetera, it's just the same. And so my default position, my starting place would be that Trump's going to win again. But then just to take it a step further, so let's talk about the polls. So right now, Biden is ahead in the national polls. Biden is ahead in almost all of the battleground states. And just for the benefit of our listeners and viewers in Australia, America has kind of a crazy system. I travel abroad a lot, and people from foreign countries say, "Jim, we don't understand U.S. politics." And I said, "Well, don't worry, Americans don't understand it either." But we do not have a national election in the United States. We have 50 separate state elections plus the District of Columbia. So we have 51 separate state elections. And we don't vote for president. The president's name is on the ballot. You can check Trump or Biden, but you're actually voting for a pre-selected group of so-called electors by state. And then those electors get together on December 14th, and they pick the president. So when you vote, you're voting for electors from your state. And you need 270 electoral votes to win out of 538 in total. So 270 is one more than half. But the point is, the popular vote doesn't matter. I fully expect Biden to win the popular vote. Hillary won the popular vote. Al Gore won the popular vote in 2000. I fully expect Joe Biden to win the popular vote this year. It doesn't matter. What matters is how many states do you win, how many electoral votes per state, and then add them up. And if you get to 270, you're the next president. And they're not proportioned by population. There are states that have more electoral votes than their population would warrant, but everybody gets at least two. So even if you're in a very small population state, I'm in New Hampshire, we only have 4 electoral votes, but probably more than our population would warrant relative to California or some other places. So it's a jigsaw where you don't, Trump has no business being in California. He's not going to win California. And Joe Biden has no business. I mean, he doesn't leave Delaware, but if he were on the trail, he'd have no business going to Alabama because he's not going to win Alabama. You obviously go to the places you think you might win. Those are the so-called battleground states. So the polls you have to look at are the state polls for the battleground states. And it's a list of about 10. It's Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, New Hampshire, where I am, is one of them. There are a few others, but they're the ones where this election will be decided. The battleground state polling is simply not as accurate as the national polling. It's just harder to do. It's very expensive. I've worked for potential presidential candidates and conducted polls. So I've worked behind the curtain, so to speak, designing the polls and interpreting the results and working with professionals, the top names. And it's a lot of work and it's very, very expensive. So, so that's the starting place. So looking at the battleground polls, Biden is ahead in those, almost all of them, with the maybe Trump has an edge in Texas, and maybe one other. So you say, well, what's the point of having the election? Biden wins nationally, even though it doesn't matter. Biden wins the battleground states. They do matter, but he's just going to win. This is a foregone conclusion. And the answer is no, because those polls are badly flawed. And this is where, again, you've got to guard against wishful thinking. But let me give 7 or 8, very briefly, examples of why the polls are flawed. I could give you 15, but it's in my newsletter, but I'll give you a few just to make the point. When you're doing a poll, you have to pick your sample group. Who am I going to call? Just call people randomly. Well, your sample group needs to reflect the voting population. If it doesn't, you're going to get a bad poll. And you can't use all voters because most voters in the United States don't vote. You can't use registered voters because many registered voters don't vote. You have to identify likely voters, people who are actually going to go to the polls. Well, how do you do that? You got to ask them a bunch of questions before you ever get to the candidates. You say, well, have you voted in the last 4 elections? Et cetera. If they say, no, I've never voted, well, then, okay, you have an opinion like everyone else, but I should cross you off the list. So you got to get down to likely voters, number one. But even then, you say, well, how many Republicans and Democrats should I have in my sample? There are, in fact, more registered Democrats, more likely voters among Democrats. That's a fact. But how many more? Well, a proper skew would look maybe 53-47. That would be about right, give or take, depending on the state. But they poll 58% Democrats, 42% Republicans. So they're intentionally oversampling the Democrats to get a result favorable to the Democrats. And then you can kind of carry that down by every, college educated, non-college educated, urban or rural, African American or white, Hispanic, Asian, et cetera. You've got to get all those categories in a pretty good reflection of the population, or your poll is not going to be meaningful. Well, they don't. They oversample higher income zip codes because people answer the phone and seem to have more time. They undersample rural areas where a lot of the Trump voters live. Trump voters are generally more popular among non-college educated, so people with what we call high school education. Et cetera. Again, a long list of factors, but they don't take the time, or maybe they don't care, to sort all those factors and get them right. And so the polls are skewed in favor of the Democrat. Third point would be the sample size. So leaving aside the composition of the sample, how many people are in the sample? How many respondents do you actually get? Well, statistical science says that you need about 1,300 to have a good poll. That's a valid number, or at least it gets you there. 1,300, you'll have a margin of error of about 3%, which is a big margin. By the way, 3% is a big margin of error in a lot of these contests that are decided by 1%. But 3% is considered a pretty respectable poll. Well, you see some of these organizations, they're polling 800 voters. Well, that's not big enough. You can do the poll, but your margin of error is going to be 4.5%. So if you show me Biden's ahead by 3 with a 4.5% margin of error, and you only polled 800 people, and furthermore, I know you skewed the poll, so I got to give Trump 2 points just to correct for the skew. Trump's ahead in that poll, even though Biden might be ahead by 4 points in my example. It gets worse from there. I mean, again, the college, non-college educated factor, polls lag. Poll is at best a snapshot. It's not the movie. So if you want to be meaningful, you need to look at a time series. If I see that, here's 5 days in a row and Trump was ahead all 5 days, but the margin got smaller and smaller and smaller, well, you don't need a PhD to extrapolate 7 more days and say Trump will be ahead in the end. That happens. And then probably most importantly, this is something I've learned recently and it's very interesting. Well, two things. There's something called the shy Trump voter. The shy Trump voter is a person who takes the polls. They're going to vote for Trump, but they won't tell the pollster. They, in effect, lie to the pollster or, kind of dance around it. Why? Honestly, people are afraid of losing their jobs. People are afraid of retaliation. People are afraid of getting a brick thrown through the window. I mean, it sounds extreme, but that's what's going on in this country. And so they'll say, yeah, I'm going to vote for Biden or whatever. They know they're going to vote for Trump, but they won't tell the pollster that because they're afraid there's something to leak. Or again, people are getting fired for their jobs just for putting a Trump sign on the front lawn. So you can't blame people for doing that. So certain pollsters, not many, not most, but a few have addressed that. They say, okay, that's a real thing. So how do we get around it? There are ways to do it. You can assure the respondent that you are going to protect the anonymity. You can do it online instead of on the phone. You can ask fewer questions rather than more so that they have, time to actually give it some thought, et cetera. And again, a couple of pollsters are doing that. Guess what? The pollsters that are doing that are showing Trump ahead. So there's a good example. And then one last voter, again, this fascinated me. There's something, it's not even the shy Trump voter. It's the voter who actually doesn't care about politics. They have perhaps never voted ever. They don't really want to be bothered. They're not pro-Trump or pro-Biden. They're just like, leave me alone. But they see the Bill of Rights under threat. They see their First Amendment right to free speech, their Second Amendment right to bear arms, their First Amendment right to freedom of religion, the Fifth Amendment right to not having property confiscated, et cetera. It's not about Biden versus Trump. They see Biden as someone who will take away their liberties, and they're going to vote for Trump. Now, they're not on anybody's radar screen. They're probably not on voter registration lists. They're not prior voters. They haven't responded to polls before. They're registering for the first time. They are overwhelmingly going to vote for Trump, even though, again, I don't want to overstate their political activism, that there's no political activism, but they're coming out. So now when you put all these things into the blender and push blend, it is pretty clear that Trump's going to win. And there are other non-statistical factors, anecdotal factors, as I described. I mean, I'm here on the water. I look out my window and I'll see a Trump boat parade, 20 boats. It's a lot of work putting up Trump flags and all that. That sounds like typical election year stunts, but you don't see the Biden boat parade. There is no Biden boat parade, et cetera. And then so it's just an accumulation of things. But when you look at the polls that adjust for the kinds of things I'm describing, and when I do my own adjustments, kind of reverse engineering what I consider to be flawed polls, it puts Trump ahead in a lot of these key states. And so I expect he'll win.
So if Trump wins the Electoral College, but Biden wins the popular vote, and there are disputes perhaps over mail-in voting or whatever it might be, do you expect the outcome of the election to be disputed, and will it be called on the night, and what impact will that have? And Nick, I know you've got some thoughts on the issue too, so feel free to chime in. But Jim, if you want to give us your thoughts on that initially.
Yeah, it's a very good question. The risk of disputes, serious disputes, may be the worst in history. Now here I go back to 1876. In the election of 1876, neither candidate, it was Benjamin Harrison and Samuel J. Tilden, neither candidate got a majority of the Electoral College. There were four states that were so disputed and so close that they sent two slates of electors. By the way, Florida was one of them. Florida seems to be a repeat offender, but there were two states that sent two slates of electors. So then it fell to the Electoral College itself, and maybe ultimately the House of Representatives, to decide, did Florida go for Tilden or go for Harrison? And all the electors showed up. They said, we're here to vote. And they said, which one? So, and that was finally agreed between the parties. The Democrats gave the Republicans the votes. The Republicans got the White House, but the Democrats got the end of Reconstruction and 90 years of racial segregation as their part of the deal. But as for this year, First of all, we're seeing an unprecedented surge in mail-in ballots. There's always been some mail-in ballots, and some states are very good at it. Florida and Oregon are two states that have a lot of experience and do it well. But Pennsylvania is a state that has never done it before on this scale. Now, an absentee ballot, you go in and request it and drop it off. That's fine. That's standard practice. But these mass unsolicited mailings where, people are sending them in, and we've got these drop boxes. Some people are throwing fire bombs in the drop boxes. Seriously, they're burning up all the ballots, and you wouldn't even know your ballot was in there. So there's a lot of fraud around the edges and potential for delay. Some of this is being litigated now. The litigation is not waiting for election day. The litigation is going on now. So, for example, in some states, the statute said the mail-in ballot must be received within 1 or 2 days, let's say, after the election. So you could be getting votes on November 4th and November 5th. But they've gone to court and said, well, no, let's make it 8 days, or let's make it 9 days in one case. So it might be November 12th before the votes even arrive, let alone how long it takes to count them. And they're getting millions of them. Ever try counting 1 million envelopes by hand? Good luck. So there's the potential for delay at a minimum. But beyond that, each campaign has an army, I would describe it as bigger than a team of 600 or more lawyers each. And these are election law experts from the top law firms. These are not ambulance chasers from small towns. So no offense to ambulance chasers. But the point is, they're ready to litigate to the hilt in every one of these swing states. And some of these cases will go to the U.S. Supreme Court. And we're just now getting around to filling a vacancy on the Supreme Court. Can you imagine? We'll have Amy Coney Barrett in. She's in time for this, but imagine if you had 4-4 decisions. I mean, then what would you do? So, between and I always say Americans are lucky they can renew their driver's licenses, let alone follow all these rules on mail-in ballots. So what do you have to do? You have to check the box. Some people forget to do that. Like, I like Trump sticking in the envelope, forget to check the box. You have to sign it. That signature has to match a signature of record somewhere else in the system. Some of these have inside the mailing envelope, they have what they call a security envelope. So you're supposed to sign it, check it, sign it, put it in the security envelope, put the security envelope in the mailing envelope. Don't forget the postage. Some people think it's government mail and it's free. No, you got to put postage on it and mail it on time and have it received on time. So that's about 7 hurdles. And then the signatures have to match. If any one of them falls down, it's not, there's no postage, so it's returned to sender. It arrives late. It's not signed. The signature doesn't match, et cetera, et cetera. That vote should be disqualified. Well, you can bet that whoever was supposed to get that ballot, they're going to be in court asking for a court to give an order saying no, every vote counts, et cetera. That could drag on for weeks. In the meantime, Antifa are ready to go. They're going to start, if it looks like Trump, see what Trump might do on election night when the election day ballots are counted, and the television networks have reported it, Trump might declare victory around midnight, 11 p.m. midnight or whatever. But you could be in a state where literally millions of mail-in ballots were uncounted. Antifa is ready to start burning down American cities. I'm serious about this. I don't say these things lightly or for shock effect. You might see 20 or so major American cities in flames by November 4th as a violent rebuttal to Trump claiming victory at a time when the last mail-in ballot hasn't been counted, et cetera. And Hillary Clinton has already told Biden, do not concede under any circumstances. So we're set up for a train wreck here. The only way around it is if one side or the other has a real landslide victory. It's just they win so many states. It was all the polls are right and Trump wins very few states, or I'm right and others are right that the polls are skewed and they're so skewed that Trump wins all these states. So take your pick. But a true landslide might curtail some of what I'm describing, but I don't see that. And I do see exactly at best delay and at worst violence in reaction to the uncertainty.
Well, that has implications for what the stock market's seeing at the moment and how the stock market might react. Nick, do you have any thoughts on, how the US markets are placed at the moment? I mean, we're recording this on Tuesday, the 27th of October, and the US markets have just closed and had quite heavy falls, probably the heaviest fall since September. Now, the headlines say that's to do with rising cases of COVID virus in the States and in Europe, but obviously there must be a little bit of concern about this election outcome coming up. How do you see this playing out in terms of market reaction?
Yeah, I think the good news is that investors should have some time to sell if Biden wins in anticipation of that tax change. And that initial sell-off will accelerate, but it takes some time before policies get passed and all of that plays out. If Trump wins, I think it's going to be incredibly difficult to predict what happens for a simple reason. I don't think the Democrats are going to accept it. I think there's going to be some serious protests and some serious havoc if it's even close to being close. But Trump declares victory. And I think the point to emphasize really is that usually in a US election, there's maybe one or two reasons why it might be controversial. And what Jim did in his recent report is he outlined historically how that might have taken place, or how it did take place. But this time, all of the different ways that it could go wrong, or it could be controversial, it could be challenged, they're all in alignment. They could all happen. So by reviewing how it historically played out, you realize that something's got to go wrong. Something is going to be controversial and something will be challenged in some form or another, whether it's the popular vote issue, whether it's the ballots, whether it's the timing of the declaration. I mean, Jim actually outlined one scenario which made me laugh out loud, where you could have a few days after the election, 4 different people all claiming to be the president of the United States. That's how absurd this could get. And I think that's the most likely outcome. So if investors are thinking about that as a possibility, then the uncertainty is so high that it's risky to be in the market, even if, say, you believe Trump will be elected and that will be good, or if you believe Biden will be elected and that will be bad. The level of uncertainty is simply too high. And I think they need to really think about either hedging by owning a lot of gold, which is one of the things that we often talk about at Strategic Intelligence, or selling a lot of your investments and just sitting this one out.
Well, even Nick makes a good point. It was I'm a student of religious history, among other things, and there was a period, I believe, in the 15th century, maybe a little bit earlier, when there were 3 popes. There was a pope in Avignon, one in Genoa, and one in Rome, and they all claimed to be pope, and they had to sort that out. So, but you could have, you could have Trump claiming victory, you could have Biden claiming victory based on mail-in ballots that were perhaps being impounded or under dispute. But if you get to January and neither candidate has a majority, you have to go to the House of Representatives, and if they can't decide by January 20th, then Nancy Pelosi becomes president by operation of law. She becomes acting president. She's our Speaker of the House. And then finally, my expectation was that even if Biden somehow prevails, he'll be removed from office under the 25th Amendment because of his mental incapacity by summer, at which point Kamala Harris becomes acting president. So Trump, Biden, Harris, or Pelosi, take your pick, but they all have a shot here.
But it seems to me that the stock market's not pricing any of this potential uncertainty in. As I said, we had some sharp falls overnight, but up until now, it hasn't really shown any concern. And I think the narrative that the market's been running on is, will there be more stimulus coming? And fingers crossed, hopefully it will. And that's about it. So how are you advising clients to position themselves in the lead up to the election and immediately post-election, Jim?
Well, you're right about the stock market. There's this notion, of course, it comes out of the faculty lounge at Harvard or University of Chicago, or places who don't know much about stock markets. But there's this notion that markets are highly efficient discounting mechanisms. They look ahead, they see what's going to happen, they bring it back to the present, and stock prices are adjusted immediately, kind of in real time, very efficiently. So the market's always looking ahead. Well, the market is looking ahead, but they usually get it wrong. In other words, the market is a discounting mechanism, but they're discounting a scenario that's not going to happen. They're good at discounting and really bad at predictive analytics. So I agree with you, Greg, that the markets really don't see this coming. Markets are kind of saying, well, with Trump, it'll be more the same, and we kind of know what Trump is, and that's probably good for the stock market. The stock market's rallied strongly, both in the first 3 years of his administration and since the bottom of the pandemic panic that we had in February, March. So why wouldn't that continue? Trump means less regulation, lower taxes, et cetera. But on the other hand, Trump means the confrontation with China is going to get worse. And maybe we talk about China a little bit if you like. Biden, people have a very benign view of him. First of all, I don't think there is a Biden. He's sort of, as I say, is a bit of a husk. But if you look at his platform, I think people are assuming, if I say people, market participants are assuming that the bow in the direction of the radicals and the progressives, the Bernie Sanders wing, what we call the Bernie Bros, with stuff like packing the Supreme Court and Green New Deal and all that stuff. It's just window dressing. It's just to keep that wing of the party on board till Biden wins, and then he'll get back to normal and be a nice, mildly liberal, middle of the road Democrat, and it'll be all good. Nothing could be further from the truth. When the Biden people, they literally imported the Bernie Sanders website into the Biden website. The Bernie Sanders platform became the Biden platform. That was not accidental. That was a deal. They said, "Hey, you want us on board?" Because the Bernie people stayed home in 2016. They didn't like Hillary. That's part of the reason Trump won then. If the Bernie people stay home, then Trump it's almost a foregone conclusion. Biden needs Bernie, but the Bernie group, the Bernie Bros, the AOCs, the Elizabeth Warrens, the radicals of the party want their platform enacted, and they're going to insist on it, and bearing in mind that Biden doesn't really have the strength to resist that. And of course, it'll all come down to the cabinet, and they'll all be handpicked to support the far left. So I think when the stock market wakes up to that, doubling capital gains taxes, more regulation, the end of the oil and gas industry, tell me what stocks are going to do. They're going to crash. And so like, why aren't they crashing now? Well, this is because, again, the stock market's forecasting ability is just awful. I mean, look, they did not see the 2008 crisis coming. They did not see the 2020 crisis coming. They did not see the dot-com crash coming. They never see anything. They muddle through. But if Biden wins, there's a real train wreck sooner than later. The market doesn't see it. The market will wake up to it at some point. I describe this as the perception reality gap. Here's the perception that's kind of all good, and here's the reality that it could be horrendous. Now, reality always wins. Reality always wins, but not right away. Sometimes that gap can persist for a while before it finally closes in favor of reality. That's a great opportunity for investors, by the way. If your predictive analytics are better, and you actually can get the forecast right, and you see the market's got it wrong, then you can own that spread and make a lot of money.
Speaking of Biden, and you made a comment there that the perception of Biden is just a reasonably benign political figure, yet some of the commentary and the revelations that have come out in the past couple of weeks have shown the Biden family to be anything but. And, there's a lot of evidence out there that Hunter has been using the Biden name to cut deals with foreign adversaries, and Joe Biden has been getting a cut of those deals. And I guess the bigger issue to come out of this is the censorship that has been imposed by the social media giants and the mainstream media in trying to squash this story. Why do you think the mainstream media are so intent on getting a very left-wing, potentially a very left-wing government into power and are so against Trump? And this sort of speaks to a lot of your commentary around the swamp draining activities that Trump has been undertaking for the past 4 years and really trying to undermine the establishment that has enriched itself in the US for quite some time. If you could just talk about that a little bit, I think that'd be quite interesting for listeners.
Sure, let's let unpack there, but so as far as the journalists are concerned, they have two problems. They're miseducated and they hate Trump, and that's about all you need to know. I mean, when I say they're miseducated, they went to fine schools. They went to Brown or Cornell or Colby or Bates or some good liberal arts college or Dartmouth. They've got the credentials, but they were taught a load of garbage by a lot of left-wing professors who have been kind of lurking in the wings for 40 years. So they don't understand economics. They don't understand markets. And that's not that that's the be-all and the end-all of public policy. It's not. But they basically swallowed an anti-American line. And they just hate Trump. And one of the most insightful comments I've heard on that came from Rush Limbaugh. He's a very popular radio show host. I think his audience is like 12 million people. It's really extraordinary. And he said something the other day that really struck me. He said the media are not afraid of Trump. They're afraid of each other. And what he meant by that was, if you actually wanted to, go out on a limb or do your job or investigate Hunter Biden or source something or get a scoop, et cetera, you would risk the complete hatred and isolation of your peers. All of a sudden, your cocktail party invitations dry up, your dinner invitations dry up. If you work for the New York Times, you'll probably be fired, et cetera. And so it's always, and by the way, there's a lot of social science research to support this view, which I've studied in the market, in the risk management context, but it applies. It's sociology and applies in other contexts as well. People would rather be wrong and in the consensus than to be right but out on a limb.
Well, it happens in the stock market too, right? I mean, that's the
correct. And so there's groupthink, there's uniformity, there's conformity, there's miseducation, and just outright Trump hatred for reasons I don't understand. But it's there, it's real. You can practically taste it. So that's kind of where they're coming from now. And then now Facebook and Twitter and Google more generally, those search engines and algorithms have been rigged against Trump for a long time in terms of what we call shadow banning. So, I mean, I have 170,000 followers on Twitter. It's a decent sized following. But if I send a tweet, does it reach all 170,000 or has, behind the scenes, have they cut me back to 20,000, 30,000, enough to make it seem like I got some follow-up, but how do I really know? And the answer is, I don't know. That's been going on for a long time, but now they've taken a step further, outright censorship, just censorship, where we are not, they disabled the Twitter account of the New York Post. Now, just for the benefit of our Australian audience, the New York Post was founded in 1801 by Alexander Hamilton. It is the oldest continuous daily newspaper in the United States, older than the New York Times and all the rest. It is a very credible source, a very reliable source, and they work very hard and they have good reporters. But their Twitter account has now been disabled. So I'm part of the resistance to the resistance, for want of a better word. But what I do and what a lot of other people do, and people with a lot more reach, bigger megaphones than I do, we can get a New York Post story just by going to the New York Post website and taking the URL. Then you kind of run it through a washing machine, like a URL shortener or whatever. And then I tweet it out and others do the same, not just me. So the story gets out there, but it gets out there through back channels, which are other people who take the link and send it to their followers, rather than anyone being able to go right to the New York Post Twitter feed because it's shut down. So this is, like I said, this is just outright censorship. I do ask myself, why would you be that desperate to hurt Trump if you thought Trump was going to lose? That's another thing I can add to my anecdotal evidence pile that boy, you must be really desperate if you're going to those lengths to hurt Trump at this late stage. So that is that's out there. I don't. It's something about human nature, something about psychology, self-interest, unwillingness to deviate from the party line. People in a thought bubble. If you spend all your time talking to people just like yourselves, guess what? You're good luck getting a contrary opinion. I'm leaving tomorrow. I'm doing a 3-day road trip to Western Pennsylvania. I'm going by car. It's a 1,600-mile round trip, but I got to do two things. I got to get off the East Coast. I just want to talk to some, voters and kind of real people in a real swing state and see what they're doing. But I always say that people on Wall Street in Washington don't get away from their desks enough. They spend too much time in front of their screens, and how could they possibly know what real Americans are thinking?
I think that probably sounds a familiar story to you, living in London, and it's a similar bubble in that city, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's what makes Jim Rickards different, and along with, I'd say, Mark Farber and Nigel Farage and a lot of other people who seem to have a good record of predicting electoral change, they go and ask the people who vote. It's a novel idea. That's something that pollsters don't actually do. And I think what Jim said about the journalists worrying about their fellow journalists judging them for being pro-Trump or even reporting something vaguely pro-Trump, well, that applies to pollsters as well. It applies in the betting markets. It's all relevant, and it's all skewing everything right across the entire spectrum, all in favor of Biden. The interesting thing about that is that you should be able to unravel just how big the skew is. But when you do, as one of the polls did, you get attacked from all sides as being
Right.
an uncredible pollster and a right-wing hack and whatever else. So it's very interesting to see the people who are trying to be accurate getting vilified instantly. And that's what illustrates that those fears of shy Trump voters and these people that are being selective about who they tell which way they're voting, that those fears are justified, and the actions are really playing out where there's reprisals and vilification of Trump supporters.
Yep. And Nick's exactly right. And by the way, if you do have good predictive analytics and you're willing to kind of act on them, you can make a lot of money because by definition, the trade you're thinking of is not the popular trade. For example, on June 20th, 2016, I was in London and I rented one of the bubbles on the London Eye. You can rent the whole thing. It's not cheap, but we rented it for 2 turns, 2 rotations. We went in, had the bubble to ourselves, set up a film crew, and I looked right at the camera and I said, this was 3 days before the Brexit vote. And I said, the UK is going to vote to leave the EU. And here's what you should do. You should short sterling and go long gold, just categorically. And at the time, by the way, the betting odds were 70% for Remain. But I had to explain to people that the betting odds didn't give you the right answer because bookies are not stupid. Bookies set odds not based on the number of bets, but on the weight of money. And the people voting for Remain were, the city crowd, city bankers and so forth. And they were betting, 10,000 pounds or whatever on Remain. And the people voting Leave were, up in the north, and they were betting a $5, right? So, so if you're the bookie, you got to give Leave short odds because otherwise you're going to lose all your money if you're wrong. But I was able. It was Ladbrokes and Paddy Power, there are a couple of big betting places in London. I was able to get the number of bets, not the amount of money, not the odds, but the number of bets. And there were more bets on Leave than Remain. And when you're in the voting booth, money doesn't matter. It's 1 vote per person. So again, you got to take the superficial data that everyone's touting, deconstruct it, and see what it really says. But for months afterwards, I got unsolicited emails and tweets and so forth. Hey Jim, thank you for putting my kids through college. We followed your advice and made a fortune. So so there is opportunity if you're not afraid to step outside the consensus, assuming you've done your homework.
But just be careful if you do, because you might lose a lot of friends and you might get in big trouble. And the people who did trade financial markets betting on Brexit, they got investigated, they got hounded by the press, they got accusations of insider trading and manipulation, and it went on for months and months and months. So
right.
You might make a lot of money, but you'll lose some friends.
Right. The right mix probably for this situation, because there is so much. I mean, I have a view, and my model says Trump's going to win, but it's not overwhelming by any means, and you have to allow for the fact that Biden might win. What you probably want to do is reduce volatility and hedge against uncertainty. And the way to do that, I would lighten up on my equity exposure. I would increase my allocation to cash. Cash is the opposite of leverage. Leverage amplifies your returns, but amplifies your losses. Cash actually dampens it all down. So if you have volatile assets like stocks or gold in your portfolio, and you have a slug of cash, I call it the barbell approach, it'll reduce the overall portfolio volatility because cash has no volatility. And then have a slice of gold. I've always recommended 10% of your investable assets. Gold is going to do well in all states of the world, whether Trump wins or Biden wins. And certainly if there are contests and worse yet, riots, gold will do extremely well. So I'd have 10% gold, maybe as much as 30% cash. There's still room for equities. You don't have to sell every last stock, but I'd lighten up a little bit. I'd be, sometimes people don't understand gold. Say, Jim, don't you get upset? How can you possibly put money in gold? And I say, how can you possibly put 90% of your assets in stocks? That seems like the craziest thing I've ever heard. So yeah, there's room for stocks selectively again, but I have a big slug of cash and some gold.
Speaking of hunting, Jim, as you know, the Melbourne Cup is coming up here in Australia. It's on the same day as the election. You were there 4 years ago. I've been having a few punts in the lead up to Melbourne Cup, and I've noticed on my tab account that Trump is paying $2.50 for the win versus Biden's $1.55, I think. So there is some value there for Trump if people want to have a small stakes bet.
I had my best day at the races at the Melbourne Cup. I made a lot of money that day, and but no inside information, just to put Nick's mind at ease. But it was just one of those days when we won some bets in the beginning, and we just parlayed our winnings and ended up very happy at the end of the day. Yeah, that's a spectacular event. Good on Australia for having such a great national event.
Well, unfortunately, there'll be no one there this year. But if you do have any tips for us, mate, send it through. I'm just conscious of time. We've been running for nearly an hour. I just want to finish with a question you mentioned earlier about China and the comments I just made about the Biden family, the allegations of deals done with Chinese firms. What do you think? Let's just say that you're wrong here and Biden does win the election and Biden does get into power. One of the defining features of Trump's presidency has been the increased tensions with China, trade wars, and Trump trying to wrest back the advantage that the American manufacturers have given away to China over the past, say, 20 years. Do you think that would be markedly different under Biden? And what do you think would be the implications for Australia's trade relationships, diplomacy with China? Can you give us your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it'll be very, very different and very significant for Australia if Biden wins. One of the ways to kind of get to the truth or reality of what's going on, because there's so much, fake news and accusation, counter accusation, spin, et cetera. You got to sort through it all. But when you look at what the left and the progressives are accusing Trump of doing, that's pretty much what they're doing themselves. That's just whatever the Russia conspiracy and the hoax and the impeachment, and Ukraine, and all these things have gone on for years. Trump didn't do any of them. He was exonerated, or nothing found, et cetera, on every single one. And it turns out, as more facts come out, that the Democrats did all of them. And it's so different with Biden and China. So if Biden's corruption, his family's corruption with regard to China, using his son Hunter, his brothers Frank and Jim, what we call cutouts, bagmen, some of this is gangster operations. Some of it's used by our intelligence services. It's all pretty standard stuff. And the Bidens seem to have had a good grasp of that. But it's so bad and so pervasive. I've gone to China with a pen. I don't take a cell phone. I don't take a lot. I know they scan everything. I know they download everything. I know when you're out for dinner, they break in your room and, et cetera. They've got cameras. So knowing that, I take a pen and just make handwritten notes and carry them with me. But you can imagine what they have on Biden and Hunter Biden from hotel surveillance, audio tapes, private meetings, et cetera. So Biden's president, he will be blackmailed by China in exactly the way Trump was accused of. It was never true in Trump's case vis-a-vis Russia, but it will be true in Biden's case vis-a-vis China. As far as Trump's concerned, I'll just leave the listeners and viewers with one thing. And I've just written a book. It'll be out January 12th. I think we're working with our friends in Australia to kind of make this a promotion available to subscribers. Mm-hmm. It's called The New Great Depression, Winners and Losers in a Post-Pandemic World. And it has two chapters, one chapter on the pandemic, one chapter on the lockdown, then three chapters on finance. And then at the end, it kind of gives some advice to investors before getting to the conclusion. But in the chapters on China, it's very clear that this was at best gross negligence on the part of the Chinese in terms of how they covered up. By the way, I applaud Australia. Australia has led the world in insisting on international inspections, insisting on more transparency. The U.S. calls for that, but I think Australia has really the leader in this. So that's great, as I say, great leadership by Australia. But it may be worse than that for China. Maybe these may actually be crimes against humanity, and the evidence is very good that it came from the laboratory. There's this whole wet market versus laboratory, where this come from. I've researched that thoroughly. There's a lot of information. It points straight to the laboratory. Anyway, it gets to the United States. We've suffered more than any other country in the world. Total cases, total fatalities, total economic damage. I do a lot of financial warfare planning for our Defense Department. I can't imagine much more devastation if you had sent bombers over than what actually happened. There will be lawsuits in the U.S. federal district courts with China as a defendant, various Chinese entities, et cetera, claiming damages for the cost of COVID, basically based on negligence theories and perhaps criminal theories. The damages are probably at least $4 trillion, perhaps more. And you can win those cases. It'll take time, but you could win those cases. So now you get a judgment, and people kind of laugh at me with my ideas. They say, well, oh, great, Jim, you got a $4 trillion judgment against China. How are you going to collect? That's a phone call, because China owns $1.4 trillion of U.S. Treasury securities. The last time the Treasury issued a paper security was 1979. Those securities are held in digital form by the U.S. Treasury, and we know who they are, and we know which are China's. So a court could appoint a custodian or conservator for the benefit of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit, transfer China's 1.4 trillion of treasuries to the trust, and then administer that trust for the benefit of the victims. That would knock China's reserves down by half, would knock down their liquid reserves by more than half, and as I say, deplete them of their dollar assets. And then people go, oh, Jim, that'll never happen because you'll destroy the treasury market. No, you won't. But you'll basically, by taking 1.4 trillion of potential floating supply off the market, you'll increase the demand for treasuries because people won't know where to get them. By the way, the U.S. is very good at this. We got Bayer aspirin in 1917. We took it from the Germans. It was Bayer AG, was their big drug company. We just took their U.S. aspirin affiliate. Talked to the Shah of Iran about U.S. seizing assets. Talked to the mullahs in Iran about U.S. seizing assets. We're very, very good at it. So I could see the U.S. not defaulting, not seizing, not stealing, but having by operation of law, having a judge convert the Chinese treasury holdings to a trust for the benefit of the victims. I always say, if I can think of it, the Chinese can too. They're pretty smart. So if you're China and you see a $1.4 trillion conversion of your securities coming in a few years, what are you going to do now? You're going to buy fewer securities. You're going to shorten your maturity structure, and you're going to buy gold. So this is how, if we have good predictive analytics, we can bring it forward and come up with investment strategies that work today.
Well, I have probably another 20 questions that follow on from that, but I will leave it there. It's been a fascinating conversation. Jim Rickards and Nick Hubble from Strategic Intelligence, thanks so much for joining us and giving us your thoughts on the upcoming election. Jim, wish you well on your upcoming road trip. And Nick, wish you well on your move to Japan, mate. We'll catch up with you again soon. Thanks, guys.
Thanks
very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Jim and Nick. If you do want to subscribe and get more information and regular updates, click on the link below. It's Jim's Strategic Intelligence Service. It's a great read, comes out with weekly updates and monthly in-depth reports. Click on the link for more information. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you again soon.